The story begins with a single, shuddering image. A man wrestling through the night with something that was not entirely human and yet not entirely not divine. A struggle so fierce that he left the encounter limping and renamed, an emblem of a life that had been shaped by deception, promise, and providence. In the book of Genesis, in the age of the patriarchs, the actions of one family would ripple outward to shape tribes and nations, and Jacob stands at the center of that turning point. Prepare to travel from the cramped tents of a feuding household to the lonely stone at Bethel, and from a foreign land of labor to a dark riverbank where a night fight changed a name and a destiny. Have you ever wondered whether God uses broken decisions to accomplish a holy purpose? Genesis 25 through 35 record moments that ask that question again and again. In what follows, we will trace Jacob from his birth to his burial, examine the moral complications of his choices, and uncover the ways God turned personal failure into a multi-generational promise. Stay with this account to the end to see how a man who used cleverness and concealment became the father of a people, and how his life speaks to our own moments of striving and grace. The narrative that follows will move chronologically from origin to legacy, and will pause often to listen to dialogue, to smell the cooking smoke of a household, to feel the grit underfoot, and to hear the prayers muttered into the dark. The Lord will appear as promise giver and as the presence who wrestles alongside his servant. Jacob was born into conflict. Before he drew breath, the womb conversation foretold a struggle, the elder shoving against the younger, even in the dark before birth. Isaac and Rebekah, a couple who had waited long years for the fulfillment of a promise, found their household marked by rivalry from the first cries. Genesis 25 sets the genealogy and the promise, from Abraham to Isaac, and from Isaac a line that would carry blessing. The family landscape included Esau the firstborn, a hunter with hair on his arms and the taste for open places, and Jacob, who preferred the tents and whose hands found their work in the dim light of domestic life. The tension between them was not merely personal, it was theological. Primogeniture, the right of the firstborn, bore weight like a legal clause that could determine honor, inheritance, and leadership for a tribe. The Lord had spoken to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, a reversal of human custom and a seed of future contention. The smell of animal skins hung in the tent where favorite meals were served and promises were discussed. The sight of Esau returning from the field, sweaty and smelling of game, contrasted with Jacob, sitting by the fire, fingers stained with stew. The sound of laughter in one tent, the hush of scheming. In another, the heat on a midday tent flap, the texture of raw lamb, the bitter tang of worried prayer. These all set the physical world in which the struggle of blessing unfolded. Jacob's early life split between a longing for honor and a readiness to use opportunity. He was astute, observant, and, some would say, opportunistic. His backstory needs a fuller telling to understand how his methods were shaped. Born after years in which his parents had prayed and the promise seemed delayed, Jacob carried within him both the ache of desire and a conviction that the blessing belonged to his line. His childhood was a weave of stories told around the tent fire about the faithfulness of God to Abraham and Isaac, and the fear that delay could mean loss. In his mind, the promise was urgent. The interior of that mind was formed by long evenings listening to Rebekah's interpretations of family destiny, by the contrast of Esau's quick satisfactions and Jacob's longer calculations, by the quiet ritual of sibling competition over small favors that hinted at larger stakes. At a practical level, he learned to bargain, to read hunger, and to move behind the scenes. He knew the rituals of blessing, the posture of a son at his father's feet, the words that a father might speak that could shape futures. There was a tenderness in him too, a capacity to long for a place, for recognition, and for security. That tenderness sat uneasily beside a willingness to scheme. Those two strains would collide repeatedly. Physically, he was the kind of man who could remain awake late, who could crouch and listen at a doorway,
who could blot out a firelight with a hastily thrown cloak. He believed the promise that had been spoken to his mother, and he was driven by it, even when his path to the promise was morally ambiguous. In the quieter moments, he would retreat to prayer, to a makeshift altar, to the night sky that seemed full of stars like reminders of covenant. In the louder moments, he would bargain and plan, not always trusting the slow work of God, but attempting to force an outcome. Opposing Jacob in temperament and in claim was Esau. His backstory explains the volcanic short attention span and the tragic impulsiveness. Esau was a man of the open country, a hunter who loved the wind, the taste of meat, and the immediate satisfaction of appetite. Raised as the firstborn, he bore the expectations of leadership and the rough honor of a patriarch in training. Yet he was also marked by a kind of indifference to ritual forms. To him, a blessing could be missed in a moment of hunger. An inheritance could be traded for the fix of a taste. He had friends who admired his courage and mocked his domestic brother as weak. His hands were calloused from bowstring and spear, his hair tangled from wind and water, his garments carrying the scent
of long days. Those who approached him saw a man built for battle and bred alike. The antagonist role in this account is not merely villainous. Esau carried grief when he discovered the deceit, a grief that hardened, then softened, a man who forgave, but who also remembered. His sense of honor meant that when he returned at his father's command and found himself replaced, he did not quietly accept the loss. He howled a lament and then plotted against his brother, emotions that would send Jacob across borders into exile and incite long seasons of separation. Esau embodied the cost of impulsivity and the tragedy of a blessing that passes like a mist if not grasped in time. The defining precipitating incident came one evening when the smell of stew thickened the tent air and the hunger of one man collided with the calculation of another. The dialogue of that night must be set out in detail to show how moral lines blurred. Esau came in from the field, tired and smelling of the hunt, and said to Jacob, "Let me have some of that red stew, I am exhausted." Jacob answered, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau laughed in disbelief and said, "I am about to die. What good is a birthright to me?" Jacob replied, "Swear to me now." Esau made a hasty vow, slipped a hand to the skin of the bowl, and ate, tasting salt and red lentils, feeling warmth in his belly and an odd chill in his heart. He said, "Swear to me like a brother." Jacob put words into a legal form, the rustle of tent cloth punctuating his tone. Esau, his throat full, said, "I swear." Jacob signed the agreement. The scene is thick with sensory detail. The steam rising from the stew, the coarse texture of the clay bowl, the muffled sound of goats in the courtyard, the metallic tang of a signetling as Jacob pressed it to secure the pact. This transaction was simultaneously comic and tragic. It registered as one of those dramatic irony moments where the viewer sees the long-term implication that the man in hunger failed to comprehend. It also set a narrative tension the story feeds on. What does a blessing mean when it can be sold for a meal? What does a promise mean if it can be bartered? That barter was not the end, but the beginning of a chain of deceit that would culminate in the night of the blessing. The scene of the blessing is perhaps the most morally ambiguous episode in Jacob's life and demands a sustained and detailed dramatization. Isaac, his father, at an advanced age, called for Esau to hunt and prepare him a savory meal so that he might bless his elder. Rebekah overheard and conceived a plan. The conversation in the tent that followed became a series of carefully measured actions and counteractions. Rebekah said to Jacob, "Now listen to me. Go to the flock and fetch me 2 choice kids, and I will prepare them for your father just as he likes. You shall bring the food to your father, and you will be blessed instead of Esau." Jacob answered, "But my brother is hairy, and my father will feel me and know." Rebekah replied, "Let your hand be strong. I will take the curse upon myself if you will but do this." Jacob hesitated, fear nearest to his throat, and said, "If I must, I will." Rebekah sent him out with skins of goats to make the smooth skin of his hands less suspicious, with garments of Esau to lay about his shoulders so the scent of the field would cling to him. The scene is sensory in the extreme: the smell of cooking meat, the scratch of goatskin, the whisper of secret planning, the bitter taste of fear in Jacob's mouth, the heat of the lamp casting shadows on Isaac's wrinkled face. When Jacob entered, the aged patriarch asked who stood before him. Jacob replied in a voice not his own, "I am Esau, your firstborn." Isaac asked for food. Jacob presented it. Isaac paused, long hands shook as he reached toward Jacob and touched him. Isaac said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." Jacob lied again, voice small and tight, "I am Esau." Isaac blessed him with words that sealed authority and destiny. When Esau returned and the smoke of the stew still clung to his hair, his cry of grief filled the tent as he realized he had been deprived of the paternal blessing. The exchange that followed between the two sons and their parents crackled with accusation and regret. Dialogue multiplied. "Who deceived you? Why did you let him? I am your servant, forgive me." Each line carries weight, each physical gesture a testimony to the disorder of homes where favoritism and fear of loss rule. The sound of Esau's weeping became a motif for the unfolding story. Following that night, Jacob's world became a crucible. The immediate consequence was a threatened death. Esau vowed to kill him as soon as their father died. Rebekah, listening to the heat of Esau's anger, said to Isaac, "Send Jacob away to my brother Laban until your anger subsides and until his brother's fury is quieted." Isaac called Jacob and blessed him again and sent him to Paddan Aram to find a wife. The night before he left, Jacob had a dream at Bethel, at a certain place where he used a stone for a pillow, and the sky seemed to open. He saw a ladder reaching to heaven, with angels ascending and descending, and he heard the Lord say, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and your father Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." Jacob woke, eyes stinging with sleep and wonder, touched the cold stone and poured oil over it as an altar, declaring a vow. "If God will be with me and will keep me on this journey and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, then the Lord shall be my God." The dream scene carries a density of sensory detail. The chill of night air, the roughness of the stone under his cheek, the luminous movement of angelic figures, the scent of resin as he poured oil, the quiet that follows a revelation. The vow was both a practical promise and a liturgical act, an altar in miniature, marking the start of an exile and a trust. Jacob's time in Haran under Laban's roof would be formative and full of complications. This section of his life requires a careful account of labor, marriage bargains, family growth, and escalating domestic jealousy. Jacob arrives at Haran, thirsty, having journeyed across dust and hill. He meets Rachel by a well where shepherds keep their flocks, her beauty moving like water in a dry land. He weeps at her side, kisses her, and carries her into Laban's house, where his uncle receives him with wary hospitality. Jacob agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand. The work is described with sensory and procedural detail. Jacob tending flocks at dawn, feeling wool between his hands, hearing the lowing of sheep, smelling damp earth, his breath visible on cold mornings, the texture of raw fleece. He labored, counting days and months by the rhythm of a shepherd's life. The negotiation of marriage was not a simple contract. Laban tricked Jacob by substituting Leah, the elder sister, on the wedding night. The dialogue that followed is long and painful. Jacob confronted Laban, "Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill the week of Leah, and then we will give you Rachel also, for the other is tenderly loved by her husband." Jacob answered, "I worked 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed but a few days because of the love I had for her." Laban said, "Pay another 7, and you shall have her." Jacob agreed, Anger and love tangled in his chest. This union produced many sons and daughters, each birth named and narrated, each child bringing a new layer to the domestic tapestry and to the promise that Jacob carried. Rachel bore Joseph last, and the naming and placement of each child mattered, because each name would be a thread in the future tapestry of Israel. Among the secondary characters who populate this period are Laban, the uncle who bargains and deceives; Rachel, the beloved, who weeps for children; Leah, the eldest, who labors for love; Bilhah and Zilpah, the handmaids given as concubines and the mothers of sons; Simeon and Levi, who react with fierce solidarity later; and Dinah, whose story will later trouble the household. Each of these figures acts specifically for or against Jacob and shapes the household. Jacob's labor negotiations included watching flocks partitioned by ownership, setting out rods before mating season as a shepherd's cunning, and counting sheep by the pattern of their marks, a procedural detail that explains how sons were born into tension. The repetitive sounds of livestock and the call of shepherds, the taste of coarse bread eaten by workers, the constant presence of wool and lanolin on clothes and hands fill this period. Jacob is transformed in patience and in craft, yet he is still someone who learned to contend with deception because and in spite of his own earlier forms of deceit. Time passed, and Jacob decided to return home wealthy and ready to reconcile or to be seized by the revenge of Esau. Planning the return became a covert operation filled with fear and strategy. Jacob said to his wives and household, "We must move at once, return to the land of our fathers, and escape the face of Laban." He packed caravans, instructed servants, named people to lead different flocks, and made a list of gifts to appease Esau. The preparation was meticulous: the loading of camels, the sealing of jars, the binding of provisions, the arranging of caravans by family lines. Laban discovered the departure and pursued. The dialogue between Jacob and Laban in that moment is charged. Laban called out, "Why did you flee secretly? Have I not power over you? Which of your sons did I cheat? Tell me now what I have done." Jacob answered carefully, "I fled because I was afraid. If I had been able to stay, I would have made you leave with gifts rather than depart ashamed." Laban accused, Jacob defended, servants described the hurried packing. The desert air smelled of dust and fear. The footfalls of camels were thudding drums against the sand. And the sunset made the caravan look like a procession of moving shadows. Laban and Jacob made a covenant, piling stones and calling to witness the gods of their ancestors, a pact that marked the boundary and ended immediate pursuit. The craft of negotiation had become the craft of survival. One night, as Jacob prepared to meet Esau, he was alone and afraid. The river that would serve as the scene of the wrestling was a chill and roiling body of water. The senses are sharpened. The breath of the night felt like smoke. Stones underfoot were slick with cold. Insects murmured in the reeds. The moon was a cold face. His cloak stuck to him with sweat and river mist. He sent messengers ahead and arranged his company in ways meant to deflect or to protect. He cried out to God in a voice that mixed prayer and plan. "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, deliver me." That prayer lingered until a man met him on the riverbank and they wrestled. The episodic fight must. The first exchange was a test of strength. "Who are you?" Jacob demanded, grabbing the arm and feeling sinew and resistance. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," Jacob said as his hands closed like a vice. The other answered, "What is your name?" Jacob replied, "Jacob." A lock of wrestling continued, muscles straining, breath boiling, and the sound of cloth rubbing on stone. They grappled until daybreak. At one point, Jacob felt a touch at his hip and cried out as the socket strained, the pain sharp as a struck ember. The man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." Jacob answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The other asked, "What do you desire?" Jacob's voice was both supplicant and bold.
"Bless me." The response was a change of name, a recognition, and a promise. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." The physiognomy of that moment is vivid. Dawn paling the sky, the scent of river mud rising, the limpness of Jacob's hip, the new name falling like a stone into place. This struggle is described in Genesis 32 and stands as a pivotal theological and psychological moment. It was not simply a physical defeat, but a transformation, even as it left Jacob limping. He had sought a blessing and been given a new identity that reframed the past. The encounter with Esau after that night is charged with unexpected tenderness. Jacob approached with gifts, his face turned toward the ground in humility. He rehearsed apologies, and he arranged his family in strategic order, placing the servants and their children ahead as buffers, placing Leah and Rachel and the sons in a position that spoke to the stakes. Esau ran to meet him, and the two men embraced, wept, and reconciled. Dialogue unfolded slowly. Jacob said, "I have offended you in leaving secretly and in taking your blessing. I came to meet you with gifts and with a bowed heart." Esau answered, "I have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have taken." The sound of their crying was soft, like rain on a tent. The smell of flocks mingled with the tear salt on faces, and the sight of two weathered men with forgiveness in their hands stunned the onlookers. The community reacted with astonishment. Among the named secondary characters who appear in this scene are Gad and Asher, who steered flocks, Zilpah, who held a child's hand, Bilhah, who arranged food, Simeon, who studied his brother's face, and Jacob's eldest son, Reuben, who stood watchful and unsettled. The reconciliation did not erase the history of deceit, nor the pain of the bargain that had been struck, but it allowed a new chapter where the covenantal promise could proceed through reconciliation rather than rancor. The Lord had been present through the night, the tender morning, and in the valley.
Meeting where two brothers embraced. Jacob's later years contain further episodes of transformation and moral reckoning. The narrative slows to describe rituals performed, blessings bestowed upon sons, and the final pattern of patriarchal instruction. Jacob built altars and spoke words that named future tribes and assigned destinies upon each son. The ritual of blessing required posture and words, the laying on of hands, the invocation of God of Abraham and Isaac, a formulaic cadence that carried both memory and direction. A technical description of the blessing ritual clarifies its components. A father would take a son by the head or shoulders, pronounce a word of prophetic assignment, call upon the Lord as witness, and seal the pronouncement with a spoken formula referencing ancestors and covenantal promise. This was often accompanied by a practical sign, anointing with oil, touching an object such as a staff or a stone, and the presence of witnesses from the household or kin. The procedure was legal and spiritual simultaneously, and could not be reduced to mere sentiment. It was binding in the cultural and theological imagination of the time. In Jacob's final instructions, he gathered his sons and prophesied over each. These moments mix tenderness with sternness. He called each by name, spoke of their character, their sins, and their future. The sensory world in these closing scenes includes the hush of a tent at dusk, the rasp of a dying man's breath, the cool of linen against an aging hand, the scent of myrrh and oil, and the weight of a voice that had commanded flocks and fled for many years. Jacob died after blessing Joseph's sons, requested to be buried in the sepulchre of his fathers, and was taken back to Canaan for a funeral that would cement the memory of promise. The death scene is both culmination and continuation, a moment when the promise passes into narrative custody and the people remember. We paused earlier to invite you to reflect.
If this story moved you, take a moment now and imagine yourself in these tents. Which character do you most empathize with? The one whose hunger led to a tragic sale of a birthright? The one whose scheming secured a future? Or the one who carried wounds yet encountered God in the night? Share in the comments a single sentence beginning with "I understand," so that this conversation can remain tender and thoughtful. Your experience of these ancient dramas helps others see the shades between ambition and faith, between guilt and grace. Community reflection is part of the healing that follows hard stories, and your voice can be the bridge for someone wrestling with their own Jacob-like choices. Now we return to the narrative to follow the legacies born from these events. Among the moments of tension that must be lingered over are three in particular, each of which reshaped Jacob interiorly and externally. First, the moment when Jacob took Esau's birthright for a bowl of stew. That moment condensed impatience
and calculation into a choice whose consequences unfolded over decades. The inner tension in Jacob as he watched Esau swallow quickly while he signed a document reveals a man torn between longing and conscience. The second moment is the deceit in the tent as Jacob lay before Isaac with skins upon his hands and the old man blessed the wrong son. These minutes stretched with the sound of the lamp and the rattle of a signet ring as fate was spoken aloud. The third is the wrestling by the river, an ordeal of pain and insistence, where Jacob refused to let the mysterious other go without blessing, and in that refusal met a change of name and of posture in life. Each of these tensions is densely described in body memory, the taste of stew, the feel of goatskin, the ache in a hip, all acting as testimony. Each is followed by a decision that ripples outward and forces Jacob to live with both blessing and guilt, with certain successes and abiding wounds. These tensions are not resolved neatly, but they are transformed by encounter. In the epilogue, we see the immediate and measurable reverberations of Jacob's life. 1 month after Jacob's death, the household was in motion with practical arrangements. The sons organized the burial, families consolidated their holdings, and the community of relatives exchanged stories of covenantal moments. The smell of spices lingered in the tent, and the rhythm of work returned, even as memory pressed like a weight. The community reacted with ritual grieving and with the naming of responsibilities for tending the flocks. Reports from neighboring clans began to circulate regarding the shifting alliances and the growing reputation of the descendants as a distinct people. 3 months later, the political consequences had begun to show. Conversations among neighboring chieftains referenced the sons of Jacob as a more organized confederation with a leaderly structure forming around the eldest. The narrative of the family, now shaped by the memory of a father who had wrestled with God and had carried both blessing and frailty, became a foundation for claims of land and for negotiations with local rulers. Marriages were considered with other clans to secure alliances, and the story of Jacob's night fight became a proverb among certain circles about persistence and divine encounter. 6 months on, the seeds of legacy grew into tangible institutions. The children of Jacob were learning to claim their identities, to trace lines of descent, and to name themselves as inheritors of the promise. Rituals of remembrance were instituted, altars raised at significant sites, psalms composed that narrated the ladder dream and the river struggle. The Lord's promise, spoken to Abraham and renewed to Isaac and Jacob, continued to be cited as the theological glue that bound the family and authorized their claim to land and identity. In those months, the community began to tangibly understand that from Jacob's brokenness, a new people was being formed, a legacy both fragile and tenacious. The theological synthesis is clear and practical. Jacob's life shows that blessing is not a reward for moral perfection, but a thread that weaves through human failing into divine fidelity. The Lord acted in dreams, in vows, and in the nocturnal struggle to continue the promise given to Abraham. Jacob modeled both human frailty and a fierce perseverance that refused to let go of God until blessed. Practically, we learn that our strategies may be flawed, but that persistence in seeking God can transform identity, that reconciliation is possible even after deception, and that wounds can become marks of new naming. For viewers today, the challenge is to let God wrestle with us in our nights rather than always using our own schemes, to strive for honesty where manipulation tempts us, and to practice reconciliation with those we have wronged. If this story has given you comfort or provoked your conscience, consider subscribing to follow more narratives that examine the lives of biblical figures with both historical care and devotional sensitivity. Here you will find grounded study that respects the text while inviting modern application. Share this with someone who wrestles, and keep the conversation gentle and honest. Remember that even in our broken choices, the Lord can be at work, and that a new name may come through the strain of honest struggle. The closing word is brief but certain. From the night of the river to the stone altar at Bethel, Jacob's life teaches that God meets those who will not let go.